Hello, everybody. Good morning. This is Anu from Situational Consulting. I would like to welcome you all to the How to Land a Job in Consulting webinar. And I'll be taking you through a few things we'll be discussing today and also introducing you to our panelists who are actually consultants at Accenture and McKinsey. So thank you for taking time out today to join us. Just as always, we would have other consultants in the chat box actually available to answer your questions. So type your questions and we will be answering. So today we will be talking a little bit about Situational Consulting, just so that people that don't know us can get to know what we do. We'll be meeting our consultants, having a few minutes to get to know them, their background, what they do, and how consulting has really been impactful in their career journey. We're going to be talking about the pathway to getting the consulting job, which is going to be very interesting for people looking into joining consulting. Then we will be doing a mini case prep where we'll be giving an example of how not to answer the case interview and how to answer the case interview. Then we'll be having about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, but you don't have to wait till then to type your questions in the chat box. And if you're targeting a particular consultant, you can just put your question and write the name of the consultant that, okay, this person, I would like you to answer this question. So we go here. So I will introduce myself again. My name is Tommy. I'm also known as Anu, and I'm an MBA alum of the Fisher College of Business. I founded Situational Consulting a little over a year ago, and I'm honored to be speaking to all of you bright minds today. The reason why I started Situational Consulting is because I wanted to give international students a chance to actually achieve all of their goals without all of the barriers that are set in front of them. So with me, everything is impossible. Nothing is impossible, literally. A little bit about what Situational Consulting does. So we are your coaching guide. Whether it's admission services to grad school or career services, we have you covered. So we offer one-on-one grad school coaching, MBA, Masters, or PhD, majorly the MBA, for you to get into grad schools of your choice. So what we do is resume review, essay reviews, admissions interview prep, networking, how exactly to get the attention of outcome. And then we don't leave you there. We ensure that we guide you towards getting a good job in North America or the UK or whatever country that you are in, because I know that the dream for a lot of international students is that they want to come for this program and they also want to get to work. They want to experience that international work experience. And it's very difficult if you don't have the right information, if you don't start early, and if you don't have the right guidance. So we offer internship and full-time job search coaching. We offer resumes and cover letter reviews. We prepare you for diversity conferences and for other career conferences. And we prepare you for behavioral, technical, case preps, like anything you need to do to land that job here. We are ready to help you. So if you need any help, you can send an email to anu@titanalconsulting.com, coaching@titanalconsulting.com. I'm going to put the email addresses in the chat box, and we would get right to working with you. If you also want to just discuss with us for 15 minutes, we have office hours available every week that you can sign up for, and you have a consultant that will be ready to answer all of your questions for free for 15 minutes. So I feel like if you're not so sure of what you want to do, it's a very good opportunity for you to actually land on. So remember to type your questions in the chat box, and you don't have to wait till the end of the webinar to type in your questions. Now, for our consultants, today we are having Obi Nebedum and Christopher Scott. Obi is a senior strategy consultant at Accenture and an MBA alum from the Ohio State University. Obi actually was my class president in the MBA program, and I'm very honored to have him here as one of our panelists. Christopher is an incoming associate at McKinsey & Company, Also a very good friend of mine. He graduated from the Ohio State University from his MBA this May, and he will be starting up at McKinsey in September. So I would give them time to actually talk about their experience, how they got their jobs, and we'll get to know them for 5 to 10 minutes. So over to you, Obi.
Hey, good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Tommy, thanks for the opportunity to be here, and I'm excited to chat with Chris as well. It's nice to meet everybody that's on the call. As Tommy said, I graduated this past, or May of 2019 from OSU, doing both my MBA and Master's in Health Administration. Before coming to Ohio State, my work experience was really in the space of healthcare, where I did a lot of work with social services, so helping people who might not have access to health insurance or food in the United States find a pathway to having those sort of insurance and services. And then the final 2 years before I actually joined Ohio State to do the graduate school program was focused on a healthcare startup really looking to support independent doctors. So your local pediatrician or your family practitioner, help them really staff up their business and be in a stronger position to really take care of people. From that, I thought that consulting was really interesting because it allowed you to see a lot of different type of companies, a lot of different industries. And I decided to really focus my efforts on prepping for the case, talking to people like Tommy, like Chris, understanding what sort of it took to land a job in consulting and work from there. And because of that, I also love to connect with people who are in a similar space, much like yourself. So I'm really happy to talk to you all today and to meet you, and I'm happy to dive deeper into any of my background if you have questions.
Hey everyone, as Tony mentioned, my name is Chris. I graduated just this past May from the Ohio State University with my MBA, so just a year behind Obi and Tommy. Prior to getting my MBA, I have an undergrad degree in chemical engineering and spent most of my career for about 5 years before my grad degree in manufacturing and product development. So particularly in the automotive space, but I've also worked in food and beverage. Most recently, I worked for Honda here in the United States, did a variety of projects for them, including launching a couple new models for their Acura line, and also leading some development for their materials research portion in their R&D field. Similar feelings to Obi in the sense that I really liked kind of the dynamic work and project-based scope of a lot of the work I was doing, and decided to actually come back to get my MBA to make the shift into consulting. So I spent last summer, a year ago now, working with McKinsey and Company, their Cleveland office here in Ohio, and spent 10 weeks there as an intern, and then came back for my second year of MBA with full-time offer, and accepted it. So I'll be starting full-time in September with the Cleveland office. I've done some consulting work in healthcare and automotive, so I can kind of speak to both of those industries. Yeah, I'm just happy to be here. Feel free to field any questions with us. I think the other thing I didn't mention, this past year I worked in Fisher's Office of Career Management as a career consultant. And so what I did 20 hours a week was worked with people interested in careers in consulting, answering their questions, helping them put together recruiting strategies, but also helping them prep for behavioral and case interviews. So I can speak to you about kind of the interview process at almost any firm, and kind of what it takes to get to the level of being able to interview for any of them. So happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Obi. It's nice hearing your background and your story. So now we'll dive right into it. So, Obi, I believe you'll be starting us on the pathways to getting the job. Just like we've said previously, if you have any questions, just type it in the chat box and a consultant will be happy to answer those questions, or keep it till the end of the webinar where Obi and Chris could help answer your questions. So over to you, Obi.
Thank you, Tommy. Yeah, so I think one of the most challenging things that I experienced at the first part of this was just understanding what was needed in your resume. What did it have to look like? What sort of structure did it need? And there's a lot of information online, but sometimes it's hard to really connect the dots and make that leap yourself. So I think one of the other things I wanted to quickly note too, that Chris pointed out with his time at Ohio State, was I did a lot of work this year at Accenture supporting the MBA recruitment, particularly for students out of the Chicago office attending booth. I'm also based out of the Chicago office at Accenture. And so I've also helped kind of seen some insights in terms of what sort of resonates with the people on the other side, what might not. So happy to share some of those as well. But overall, there are three key things that Chris has really called out in terms of what it takes to get the job in consulting. First is you need the foundations, which is a very, very strong resume. And a resume is more than just talking about what you did or your job descriptions. It's really an opportunity for you to like share your story and your impact. And this is done through a combination of tying together your experiences and the type of skills that you have. Another part, particularly with firms that may not deliberately come to whatever school that you're attending, is to find people who can be your sponsor, who can be your advocate or evangelist for you. These are people who, when it comes time for recruitment, they'll say, hey, you know, Chris has a great story. Check out his resume. Anu has a great story. Please make sure you just give it a second to look at it. You won't be disappointed. And then last but not least, the first two help open the door to part three, which is really the interview. And so that's where you really bring all of that hard work that you've done and use it to shine and sort of build a connection with the person on the other side while bringing together parts of who you are. And so if we could actually transition to the next slide. And so you saw those 3 points, but you might be thinking, okay, so what does that really look like? And here they've kind of been broken down digestible steps across each. Though I won't necessarily dive deep, or we won't dive deep into all of them, there are important takeaways across each of these three main sections. So starting off with the resume piece, right? This is a part that you can start taking action with right now, which is thinking about your involvement and your experience. I think what's really important to think about as somebody who's considering an MBA or somebody who's on the way to doing it is to really secure that leadership component and that involvement component. So whether it's at your job, thinking about what sort of things can you do, whether it's a volunteer opportunity, whether it's a new project, if you can be the person to spearhead it, if you can be the president or VP or director of an organization. Those type of moments indicate to the firms that you have the potential for leadership and that you're somebody that can not only build on the project, but can also help shape the direction of the firm too. I think what's important with that part is to also do things that interest you. So not just do it necessarily for the title, but if you really care about helping people get consulting jobs or helping people get the jobs of their dreams like Anu's doing, that's leadership, and just speak to that sort of story. The second component of the resume really focuses on the work experience. And this is tied to both the type of industry that you're in, so healthcare, finance, construction, but it can also be tied to your functional expertise. So if you're in the HR space, if you're in more corporate finance, if you're in strategy, because firms are looking for people that can help build out that segment of their practice. Next up is the writing your resume component. And this is where I see particularly the greatest challenges for a lot of my friends, and particular friends that are international colleagues. I know for myself, and particularly the way that I kind of grew up, you don't necessarily talk about your experiences in the full way that you might have had them. And so I think it's something that's really important, regardless of where you go and who you communicate with, to kind of shift that mindset initially and to start saying, you might have worked at a bank, for example, and you saw 10 clients a day, right? And if those 10 clients a day gave you $10, you might just say, oh, I saw 10 people and helped manage their money. Versus, saying that, I was responsible for 10 different clients, overall managing a portfolio worth $100. And it's the same story, but it's just told differently and told in a way that really conveys that impact. And so while you're at your job or while you're reflecting on your job right now before you start your program, really, really reflect on that, on those stories, and also those moments in which you had a tough boss, you had a tough project, and how you sort of navigated that so that you can paint that picture for the person on the other side. And then last but not least, when it comes to reviewing or editing your resume, so you have all the thoughts up here, and now it's about really putting it on the page and delivering that story. So a great first step is to just do it. It may not look the way that you want, but from there, you have something that you can work with and find somebody that you can trust. So start with your network, people that are similarly starting their MBAs, people that have their MBAs, people like Anu, Chris, myself, and we can help you start to sort of build that out. And from there, you want to be at the position where when you talk to the evangelical or evangelist person on the other side, and they say, you know, I've really enjoyed our conversation, Chris, pass me your resume. You don't have to lose a day, an hour, a minute prepping it to be what they're looking for, but you can just pass it right there. So I'm just going to dive into the first two of the next section, and then I'll hand it over to Chris, who has done an immense amount of work in this space and can really speak to it. But when it comes to the identifying firms part, right, typically here we speak about where do you feel a cultural fit? Where do you feel that the work is interesting to you? Like, though consulting is broad, there's so many different areas to it, right? There's strategy consulting. So there's the McKinsey, Bain, BCG, Accenture Strategy, Deloitte. But then there's other firms too that are also more technical or more implementation focused, like other parts of Accenture, like other parts of Deloitte, right? But there are also firms that are specialized in certain industries. So they might be focused in finance, they might be focused in healthcare. And so whatever resonates with you, really explore that and form a broad list of those that you might feel are like super reach and those where you feel like you have access to, because it never hurts and you never know how a conversation will go. From that, then, it's important to start really connecting with people, to start understanding their experiences with the firm and add more color to the story of why you want to be there. It's like, McKinsey is really interesting to me because they do a lot of intense and amazing work in strategy. Okay, a lot of people might sort of have that story, but if you can talk to somebody and they tell you about a project that they were doing where they helped, a life science company bring a new drug to market by changing the way that they did research, that's something that really shows that you have an understanding of what that work might look like. And so I'm going to actually pause there and transition it over to Chris. And then also, Chris, if there's anything else that I missed or if I'm off base, please correct me and let us know too.
Yeah, thanks, Obi. Awesome job covering that. I think before we dive in to the rest of it, I think there's two things that I really want to call out here. The first is notice that red dotted line where it says apply, and notice how far to the right it is in the process. So many people I talk to think that submitting an application online or submitting their resume somewhere is the beginning of the job process or even the end. And it's actually neither, right? So look at how much work you're actually putting in before you actually apply to that job. And that's a good reminder of how much actually has to go into this whole process to ensure that you are an applicable candidate, right? So 90% of the work is going in before you actually apply, and then you are doing some follow-up afterwards. And you're not just letting that application float into the ether and hope that someone finds it. So that's key to the process, right? Is doing the work beforehand and considering all the steps. Because if you try to do everything a week before an application deadline, you're going to be dead in the water because there's people that have been working on this for months. The second thing I want to call out, this concept of evangelists might be foreign to some people, especially people that haven't really read up much or practiced much about networking. And a lot of people have probably heard the term evangelist in terms of a religious context or even historical context. But in this context, what we're talking about is essentially ambassadors for you, right? People like what Obi said, people that believe in you so much that they're going to speak about you when you're not in the room. So the goal when you build evangelists is not to cast a super wide net. It's to find and build relationships with people that are both relevant to your job search. That means they either work at or have connections at the firm that you want to work at, and also are meaningful relationships where there's a connection. And so kind of the intersection of that Venn diagram are people that you should be reaching out to and really building those relationships with. Because if they're relevant and you have a strong relationship, that's when you have the highest likelihood that they're actually going to be an ambassador for you on the other end. The reason we look at evangelists as part of the job application process is because in today's day and age, it's so easy to apply to a job online that it's a numbers game. You're competing against hundreds, thousands, and potentially even tens of thousands of other applications for the same job. And you don't want to have to rely on chance in order for somebody to pick your resume. The way you do that is by focusing on these first two things. The resume, if you make it an amazing resume, it's hard for anybody to overlook it. That's things like competitive test scores, good GPA, great experience, good formatting, things like that. But the second element of that is building these evangelists, because the evangelists will be the people that say, hey, Obi just reached out to me and told me that he applied to this job. we should take a look at him before we look at anybody else. And immediately you've reduced the chance in that process. So we talked about building a great resume. He also talked about building this list of firms and the people that you could potentially reach out to at those firms. The next thing you want to start doing is building these relationships. So reach out to your network. This could be friends, family, colleagues, coworkers, or other people in your MBA program, and see who has connections at different firms. A really great opportunity as well is things like info sessions or even career conferences. That's a great place to meet people face to face, or even put a name to a face, right? And kind of get yourself on the board. Start building those relationships and identify people that are meeting both of those criteria, right? Somebody you could have a connection with and somebody that's relevant to the firm. The next thing you need to do as you build that relationship and start reaching out to them is ask them for some help. Awesome opportunities to ask for help are in resume review, interview prep, asking them what they enjoy about their job and maybe what things they would change if they could, and basic questions like what's kept them there, what made them interested in that field, and really start to learn about the culture, learn about the work that they do, and build that relationship by asking for things, right? Ideally, you should have somebody at each firm that you apply to look at your resume, because they're all going to look for little minute details that are different from one another. And finally, after you've built those evangelists, after you have some people on your side and you've applied, reach back out and let them know that you applied. Notify them and say, hey, I just wanted to let you know I applied to this position in this office. I was wondering if there's anything I could do to stay competitive or anything else that I could do to make myself a good candidate, right? And finally, the interview portion, which we'll be talking about today. Every interview is going to be a similar format, but again, there's small changes for each firm and things that they're looking for, right? Especially for the position. If you're looking for a strategy consulting role, it's going to be a very different interview and very different questions than if you're looking to do tech consulting, because they're going to want to see different expertise. But overall, the overall themes of what they're looking for will be very similar: problem solving, leadership, client management, right? The ability to work with teams and collaborate. So identify those firms and identify what their interview type will be. And then this next part we're going to talk about is the idea of case interviews. And so if some of you are unfamiliar with the consulting recruiting process, a case interview is slightly different than a behavioral interview in the sense that you actually solve a business problem alongside your interviewer. And so this is something that requires practice. I don't know of anybody that's ever not practiced case interviewing and walked into an interview and succeeded. So this is something you need to think about. It's something you need to put some practice into, and we're actually going to start that practice today. Additionally, practice your behavioral interview. So these are the questions where it says, tell me about a time when you worked on a difficult team, or tell me about a time when you solved a difficult problem. And you should rehearse these things. You should be able to tell the story in a coherent, cogent way that really showcases your skills and shows that you are knowledgeable about your work experience, but also thoughtful about your approach when you work. And finally, this is where some of these evangelists come in. Practice some of these behavioral and case interview skills with these people at the firms that you are building relationships with. The best advice you can ever get is from the people who are going to be hiring you. So don't be afraid to reach out to them and say, hey, I was wondering if you could review some of my resume with me, review some of my interview skills, or even go through a practice case interview with me. So that's essentially the pathway to getting the job, right? And you'll notice it's not one linear pathway. It's 3 separate buckets that you're working on simultaneously. So you should be writing and rewriting your resume. It should be a living document. You should be reaching out to people at firms, building relationships and getting their feedback. Based on that feedback, you're now rewriting your resume, right? And at the same time, you're practicing your interview skills. All 3 of these things you're doing simultaneously. So when you hit that red dotted line, you've done as much of the work ahead of time as you can. And if you get a call and they say, hey, we want to interview you tomorrow, you're ready to go. Obi, anything to add that I might have missed?
Yeah, there are just 3 things. Great coverage, Chris. The very first one is actually tied to the identify firms part under the evangelist. I think one other really important component, particularly as an international student, is identifying firms that sponsor. Because I know that that can be a very big barrier, and you don't want to necessarily invest a lot of time in a place only to find out that they might not be willing. So that was number 1. I think the second thing is when it comes to identifying and meeting people, as Chris mentioned, this is incredibly, incredibly important, because being at wherever you are, right, at an Accenture, at a BCG, at a Deloitte, they know how they work and they know their culture. So they really trust people who say, I think this person is a good fit and it's more than just the work. And so with that, one way of meeting people is through LinkedIn. And so definitely encourage you to use that platform, but tangibly, I'll send Anu a message that can maybe be sent out to the larger group of like a format that works and is simple, where, when initially reaching out, you might say, hi, my name is Obi, and I'm really interested in Accenture. I was hoping to grab 20 minutes of your time to discuss strategy consulting. It doesn't have to be super long, and you will get some people that might not respond. But the ones, the two, the three that do are all you need sometimes to sort of set that in motion for you. And then the last thing is actually tied to the point that Chris was reemphasizing in writing your resume. One other really important thing about writing for impact is that it makes it easier for you to share your story in the interview. And so they're going to have your resume in front of them and say, okay, I see, goodness, you said that you worked at Shell and you did some work on an oil line. Tell me more about that. Tell me about these $20 million or these $100,000 in savings that you produced. And by building out these stories, you can truly tie it to your resume in a way that helps you stand out versus some other people that might read the line off the paper.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. So, Chris and Obi, is there any other thing you want to add on the pathway to getting the job, or should we go straight to the case prep?
Yeah, let's dive right in.
Great, awesome.
Okay, so what we're going to do here, before you get lost in all of the text that's on the screen, let's ignore that for just a moment. What we're going to do here is actually practice a case interview. And so as I mentioned, a case interview is an interview that's pretty specific to a couple different career paths, majority of which include consulting. Mm-hmm. What it means is during your interview, which will typically be an hour-long interview, you'll usually have the first 5 minutes to introduce yourself to your interviewer, maybe ask a couple questions or just tell them about yourself on kind of a larger scale level. Then you'll usually dive into what we call the fit portion or the behavioral, and that's where they'll ask you about some of your experience, some things about your interest in consulting or the firm. And then for the majority of the back end of the interview, anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes, it's going to be this case interview. What you do is you're presented with a business problem from your interviewer, and you actually solve it alongside them, in front of them, and show them your problem-solving skills. What they're looking for are a few key skills that you always see in successful consultants: ability to communicate effectively, ability to structure your problem solving in a way that's recreatable, right? And not just luck or happenstance in solving a problem. They're looking for qualitative analysis skills. So these are usually business acumen. Do you understand the different levers you can pull within a business to be able to improve its profitability or its performance, right? How do you lower cost or increase revenue? They're looking for quantifiable reasons behind your suggestions, and tied to that, they're looking for your quantitative ability. This is your ability to either engage with data, right? Look at tables and charts and graphs and come to conclusions based on them or based on trends, or even do math on the spot. So there will be quite a few cases where you'll do math live on the spot. They might ask you, if your client has this many in sales and their margin is this much, how much is their profit, right? And then usually there's a change question. So if we were to lower our cost by 30%, what's the impact on our profit? And they actually want a number. What they're testing here is your comfort with numbers. Not that you're perfect, you're allowed to make mistakes, but are you comfortable enough to identify those mistakes and fix them? Are you comfortable enough to identify how those numbers impact the overall problem and the overall scope of the case and how it would impact your client? And so what you're seeing here is a holistic approach at basically everything that a consultant does on a daily basis. So today, we're actually going to run through a practice case. There's going to be essentially 3 steps to this case. There's an introduction, which is where I will interview Obi and give Obi basically some background about our client, give him an opportunity to ask any questions, and then I'm going to dive in with the first question from the case. This will give him an opportunity to structure his thoughts. He'll step back and take a moment to write down some notes, put together a thoughtful answer, and then present it to me as if I'm the client. And then finally, we'll dive into a quantitative question where we'll actually look at some data, use that data to come together with some conclusions, and then Obi will present those. For each of these questions, we're going to give 2 different scenarios. Obi is going to go over what an okay, or even borderline question would be. We'll break out, we'll do some feedback, and then Obi will give you an answer again. That's our idea of what a great answer would be to a case question, just so you can see the difference between candidates that do okay at the process and probably wouldn't get passed through to an offer, and candidates that excel, and what's going to actually get you through to the next round. Really quickly, I see a question came through. How many levels of assessment/interview processes are there between applying and getting the job? Mm-hmm. This changes based on firm, but pretty common for a lot of firms. There's multiple rounds. I can speak specifically to McKinsey, and McKinsey's process is similar to the other big strategy firms like BCG or Strategy and Accenture Strategy. But round one is usually with lower tenured associates, so people that are maybe your level or 1 or 2 steps above you in the career path. And it's usually anywhere from 2 to 4 interviews with those people. Each interview will be the same format. It'll be behavioral questions and a case interview. And then you'll go on to another interviewer who will give you different behavioral questions and a different case interview. Usually round 2 is the final round. The final round is usually with more tenured members of the firm, typically partners. So the upper echelon of leadership within the firm, and they'll be the ones making the final decision. But it is basically stage gates. So you apply, and if you get through the application, you get to round 1. If you get through round 1 and all of your interviewers decide you should pass through to round 2, you proceed to round 2, and that would usually be the final round, and that's when you're extended an offer for either an internship or full-time. Before we jump in, Obi, any kind of comments on the process, or did I hit on most of it?
No, you nailed it.
Cool. So we're going to go ahead and do a little simulation. What I'd love for you guys to do is play along kind of on your own. So for this first one, I'm going to give Obi the overview of the case, and then he's going to have an opportunity to ask any questions and summarize it to me to make sure he understands everything. A key note here is usually in the interview, you will not be able to read this. I will just be giving it to you verbally. So great opportunity to practice taking some notes and noting down any important details. Today, our client is Activewear. They are a United States manufacturer of wearable smart tech, similar to a Fitbit. They manufacture wristwear and rings that track your fitness data, such as heart rate, steps, and running distance. Activewear was founded 10 years ago by 2 sisters who loved working out and has been successfully growing revenue year over year. They target a demographic of tech-savvy millennials who enjoy fitness in age groups from 15 to 39, and their products sell anywhere from a $50 price point to $325. They sell primarily online and gained web presence through digital marketing. This year, Activewear saw $800 million in revenue. Even though the revenues have been increasing year over year, Activewear has brought in our firm because their profit margins have decreased, and they want us to help reverse this. So before we dive into the questions, Obi, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, so we have this company here, and they make wearable devices.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like they've been doing really well financially. You said that they were 10 years old?
That's correct.
Okay, and then can you repeat what that revenue figure was again for me?
Sure. This past year, they had $800 million in revenue.
Okay. Great, I think that's all the information I need.
Okay, great. So that was an example of a really quick summary. The point of the summary, one, is to make sure that you have clarified information that is key to you, but then also the goal is to maybe call out any points that seem important in the data, or any problems that you think that the client is experiencing, right? So we're going to give Obi another chance right here, and he's going to show you what a terrific candidate would look like when they do their summary step. So we're going to reset, blah, blah, blah. They've brought us in and they want us to help reverse this new profit margin decrease. Obi, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting sort of challenge that they're going through. And though I don't own a Fitbit or this type of device myself, I've thought about it a lot. So let me just make sure I captured some of the details of what's happening right now, right?
Sure.
So our client is this amazing company, Activewear. And though they have had positive growth in their revenue year over year, they're struggling to maintain their profit margin, it seems like. I just want to be sure that I'm understanding sort of the company and the business model correctly, right? So their primary focus is wearables. So they're not necessarily like Apple, where they do have wearable technology, but also a different hardware or other lines of things. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so focus on the wearable part. Great. And then another thing that I want to confirm is, I think I heard you say their channel of distribution is online, right?
Mhm.
So does that mean that they don't really do a lot of work within physical retail stores?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, all of their sales are online. They don't really do any partnership with retail stores. They don't own any of their retail stores.
Great, great,
Yeah.
great. And so then, yep, and that affirms then that it sounds like they have a direct to consumer, so they go kind of straight to the person that's buying it.
Exactly.
Great, great. And then my very last thing to make sure I'm understanding, it sounds like they have a diverse range of products. Did I capture it correctly that it ranged in price from $50 to around $325?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, great. So thank you for walking me through sort of their business model. Really interesting. Is it okay if I could take a minute to structure?
Actually, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with a question.
Okay, all right.
Perfect. So let's break really quick. Key differences between the first time that it will be answered and the second. The biggest one I noticed off the bat, enthusiasm, right? Consulting is a client-facing role. A lot of what we do is making sure we interface positively with people on a daily basis. So immediately in the first answer, Obi seemed a little bit bored. He didn't really seem interested, and he didn't really make any personal connections. On the second, instead, you notice he had more enthusiasm. He was excited about the problem. He showed that he's an enthusiastic problem solver that actually enjoys doing work like this. That's going to be great because in consulting, you're working with clients and convincing them that you want to be there, that you want to help. The second thing that I noticed in the second answer, he made a personal connection to the client. So he said, we've got this great company, they're called Activewear. And then he started making connections to his personal life and how he understood their product. He immediately made that kind of more personal connection with me, who is simulating as essentially the client, right? And shows that he can essentially connect to the client and start to build those relationships. This is huge. The second thing that I think he did really, really well, besides enthusiasm and connection, is he immediately summarized the case in a concise manner in his first two sentences. He said, our client is Activewear. That's the who. They create wearable fit tech. That's the what. And their problem is that recently they've seen a decrease in profit margins, even though they've had an increase in revenue. That's the why. So he gave us the who our client is, what they do, and why we're here. That's hugely important because he just showed me that he can take this giant 2 paragraphs of context and summarize it down into 3 simple statements. Who's our client? What do they do? And why are we here? The following portion of the summary, he actually used for himself. He asked some questions, right? He said, can you just reiterate what the revenues were? That's totally okay. He may have misheard me. He may have just been busy taking notes. I gave him a lot of information. Before moving forward in the case, he wanted to make sure he had all the relevant information. And so he asked me to clarify. Perfect. He also reiterated some information to me to make sure that he got it down correct. He said, hey, I'm pretty sure this is what I had, but just correct me if I'm wrong. It looks like our product price points are from $50 to $325, right? And then the next thing, which I think is something subtle that a lot of new casers don't pick up on, is something Obi did really, really well. At the end, he drove the case. He didn't wait for me to dictate where we were going to go. He led the problem solving. And he said, hey, do you mind if I take a moment to start to organize some thoughts on how we could solve this problem? I corrected him and I said, hey, actually, I'm going to target you with a specific question, and that's totally okay. But what he did is he showed that he wants to own the problem solving process. He wants to take control and show that leadership. Consulting firms are looking for people to lead, right? They're not looking for people to come in and sit on their hands and be told what to do. There's so much work to do, and the clients are bringing in people because they have a problem that they need to solve. So those are the biggest 2 differences, right? In the first, there was an okay candidate, right? I wouldn't be too thrilled about interviewing this candidate. In the second one, I had a candidate that was engaged, enthusiastic about solving the problem, made a personal connection to the client, gave me a really great summary, the who, the what, and the why, and then went ahead and clarified some information and tried to drive the case forward. That's what you really want to do in this opening portion. You're building rapport. You're showing that you're a good problem solver. You're showing that you have good client management skills, and you're starting off on the right foot. Obi, anything else to note?
No, I think that helps. That really helps clarify. And one of the things that I really struggled with most during the casing process was understanding where it felt okay to ask questions and where it didn't. And this might seem a little bit foreign or almost overwhelming sometimes too, but it's important to just understand a different structure, like the structure is key. And it looks different for everybody, but I know for myself, right, before I can really solve a problem, I have to make sure that I really understand what's at play. And so just try to just assess in terms of understanding what is happening. And, where I see candidates that sometimes struggle is that they hear the prompt and they just go right in terms of presenting a solution, right? So a person might have just jumped in, and we'll show this later on actually, but it's just important to like feel okay taking time to understand. I think the key thing is they can tell there's a difference between taking time to understand versus being lost. And you can really clear that out through the questions that you ask. So you're understanding when you ask about business models, right? But you're lost when you say, okay, do they make health monitors too? Like that's which isn't related. So that's all that I
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. I think there's a lot of intelligence that you can show in knowing when and how to ask the right question, right? The smartest people in the world don't know everything. They know enough to be dangerous, and then they ask the right questions to inform their decisions. And I think that's exactly what Obi was doing. So we're going to move into the next slide. What I'm going to do now as the interviewer, I'm going to present Obi with what we call a qualitative question. This is a question that's a little more, as you can tell, qualitative in nature. So a little less on the numbers and more on factors or themes. I'm going to ask him this question, and then what he's going to do is he's going to step back, like you mentioned earlier, and take a couple moments. When I say a couple moments, it could be anywhere from 2 to 3 minutes, to jot down some notes and jot down what we call a problem structure. This is where you start to put together factors and a solution in a structured manner. And then he's going to come back and report. So if you're following along, what I'd highly encourage you to do is get a pad of paper, tablet, whatever you prefer to write on, and see if you can try to solve the problem as well. See if you can come up with a good answer to the problem. So we'll jump into the next slide, and I'll go ahead and kick it off. As a quick reminder, I'm going to ask Obi the question. He's going to answer it the way that an okay candidate or a bad candidate would answer. And then we're going to break out, reset, and he's going to answer it the way a rock star would answer it. So back in the case, Obi, based on our client, what factors would you consider when determining why Activewear has seen a reduction in profit margins?
Hey, is it okay if I could just take a quick moment to jot down some thoughts?
Sure, absolutely. So while Obi takes some notes, and while you're probably taking some notes, already one of the best things he did is he owned the case. And so he said, hey, I'm actually going to take a moment to go organize my thoughts and take some notes. This is huge. There's no extra points for just giving me an answer off the top of your head. And oftentimes your answer will be worse than if you take some time to think about it and structure it out. So when you're in an interview like this, it's okay to say, hey, I'm going to take a moment and think about this a little bit. I'm going to take a moment to really write down what the key factors are so that I can give you the best answer. That's the difference between good candidates and great candidates. Is great candidates own their problem solving process. Good candidates just go with the flow. So we'll have probably a minute and a half of silence, unless Obi's ready to go. I saw you came off the mic.
Oh yeah, no, I just need a little bit of time. So I'm ready.
Awesome. Okay. This guy's seasoned. Go ahead.
All right. So for my factors, I have stores, because stores, their revenue's growing, but they're not really in stores. I have products, it sounds like they might have a lot because it's priced from $50 to $325. And that just makes me think that there's a lot of things at play there. R&D, I think, is important. Maybe they spend a lot of money trying to make new things. And then last but not least is just staff. Their revenues are growing, but they might have too many people. Those are some things I think about.
Thanks. Okay. We're going to reset, and then Obi's going to give an example of a good answer. But what I want you to keep in the back of your mind is how he answered this question. And now compare it to how he's going to answer it the second time. We'll reset. Let's pretend that OB just put his head down and took some notes for a couple minutes, and go ahead. While OB's taking some notes, I just saw a question pop up in the chat. It says, I caught from your introduction that you were an engineer. How did you leverage this to gain a competitive edge against the majority with a business background? That's a great question. I was really nervous actually coming into consulting and coming into my MBA with an engineering background, because I just kind of assumed that all the business majors would know more than me. What I quickly focused on was the fact that each of those backgrounds have unique strengths. And I think one that engineers, actually two that engineers bring to the table. The first is our quantitative skills. A lot of engineers spend a lot of time in programs like Excel or MATLAB or R, or even Tableau, and we do a lot of data analysis. And so finding ways to leverage that as a strength and show that you're really comfortable with data, you're really comfortable with pulling insights from large portions of data is really helpful, because everything consultants do these days is based on data. It's all database solutions, right? And data-driven hypotheses. The second thing that I used to leverage from my background was that I think engineers are uniquely good at figuring out what their constraints are, right? So a lot of our projects, what we do is we figure out where are our constraints and we draw this box, right? What are the variables that we can actually play with, and what are the ones that are going to stay stagnant? You can apply that to business in any sense, right? Look at your variables, look at what your constraints are, and look at what are the things that you can change or adjust to get a better result. Focusing on that, but then applying a business context is really, really helpful. And I think those are the two biggest strengths that engineers bring. The other thing that I did is I used my background to leverage that in my consulting interview. So what I said is, you know, my engineering background allowed me to work at Honda and do a lot of product development. However, I was able to take on roles in product development and research that had broader spanning impact on the company, right? That were able to impact our revenue, impact our profit. And so the more you can make those connections between the work you did as an engineer and the results that came out of it from a business perspective will be really good, because what they're looking for more than anything is people that can connect the dots, right? Identify your strengths and then connect them to how they can be used in a business context. It's looking like Obi's ready. So we're going to kick off with his second chance to answer the question well.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So I know that, you know, we're not in person, so I'm going to do my best to try and help visualize sort of what I'm working through. Okay.
Sure.
So with that, I sort of have three bigger buckets, right? And the three sort of categories are first, revenue, second, expenses, and then third, I've really just categorized it as like internal or sort of and wider assortment of issues that could also be at play. Okay. And though I have multiple points under them, I'm just going to kind of call out some of the most important ones to me. So starting off with the revenue side, you know, three things sort of come to mind there, given that this is a profitability case. You mentioned that they're growing, but the three things that stick out to me are one, pricing, second, the pricing mix of their products, and third, the quantity sold. You know, within pricing, you shared a range of between $50 to $325. And so that makes me think that, okay, they can cover a wide swath of people, but I'm just curious as to the history of that pricing strategy and how that might play into their profitability. For the pricing mix, right, I think about products with different margins. So how we have an Apple Watch versus a Fitbit, right? I think though Fitbits might be selling in greater numbers, the margins of those might not be as great as an Apple Watch. And that is something that, you know, for a lot of consumer and wearable companies is something that sticks to mind. And then the third part within revenue is actually tied to the quantity sold, right? And so they've been trending positively year over year, as you said, from a revenue perspective. But I think it's also important to understand what do these volumes actually look like? And that can give me a greater sense of what direction or what sort of product line might be worth looking into. So that second bucket of expenses, right, what comes to mind are just general manufacturing processes, right? Given that so many components of hardware are manufactured overseas, and in light of some of the environment that we're in right now, that's an expense that's worth looking at. Has it maybe grown over the past few years to match their growth rate? The second part within of the three is the wearable components, or also known as raw materials, right? A lot of these devices come with different chips or sensors, and that could be a strong source of more expensive goods, and that can eat into the profit margin that they're experiencing. And then the last bit under expenses is tied to just their distribution channel. I think I heard you at the prompt mention that they're direct to consumer. And so that plays a little bit different than me going to my local store, right? Because if I'm at Activewear versus sending it to a ShopRite or a Target or a Walmart or whatever, now I have to get it to Chris. I have to get it to Obi, to Anu. And that process is a little bit different and oftentimes more expensive. The external I'm not going to focus on as much, that third bucket, but under there, I just have three things, which are customer sentiment. So do people really want these product lines? Second, in light of our competitive environment, tariffs, with just the economic factors at play. And then third is the competitive threat, where there are other players like an Apple, like a Fitbit, Nokia, whatever it is, that could be playing next door. So we have so many different areas at play. But with that said, I'm actually interested in looking at expenses first because their revenue has been.
Awesome, thanks. If you're following along, that answer compared to the first answer Obi gave is like two completely different candidates, right? The first candidate, I'm probably not going to pass through the interview round. This candidate, the second one that we just saw, crushed it, right? He did amazing. And there's so many great things I could talk about that he did. I want to be kind of careful of time, so I'll call out the major ones. First, it's this idea of top-down communication, right? The first time Obi answered the question, he basically gave me all of his answers listed in a row, right? And so he gave me one category and then dove into it, and then gave me another category and dove into it. And it's really easy to get lost in that thought process. In the second one, what he did really well is this concept of top-down communication. He gave me the large categories first. It's almost like giving the table of contents or the index for a book, right? And he's listing out what his chapters are going to be. So he called out revenues, he called out expenses, and he called out this kind of other more internal, external portion. Then he went back and he dove into revenues, finished everything within revenues, and then went into expenses, et cetera, et cetera. What this allows me to do is visually follow along his thought process on how he separates these reasons and keeps them into categories. The reason this is important for consultants is because what these would likely become is what are called work streams. One associate might be in charge of looking specifically at revenues. Another associate might be specifically in charge of looking at costs. And even though we work together, this keeps our work separate so that we can focus on different things and not duplicate work. It allows us to be efficient, but it also allows us to be fully comprehensive of the problem itself. Another thing Obi did really well is he gave me some factors within each category that might be affecting it, right? He talked about the product mix, and he reverted back to some of the information I gave him at the beginning of the case, that idea of the $50 to $350 or $325. He used data from the previous case to go back and say, hey, I noticed you said this might be an issue, we should look into this, right? Third, he pulled in relevant information that is outside of the case. So he said, given the current environmental atmosphere or socio-political atmosphere, I know tariffs are an issue. I know that there's a lot of things manufactured overseas and then brought into the country. This is something we'll want to look at. This is really good because he brought in business acumen that is specific to the environment, the industry, but that I didn't give him. It shows he has his own knowledge and he's willing to bring in his own facts. Finally, he prioritized. So he gave me this large list of considerations for a business problem. But where do we go? Obi used his business sense and his acumen to say, my intuition tells me we're going to look first at this category, right? We're going to look at expenses. Why? Well, let's use some data from the case. You mentioned that revenues are already increasing. So if revenues are increasing, I doubt that's the core problem. The core problem is probably something within costs, and that's what's driving our profit margin down. I have so many other things I could say, but I'll be conscious of time. Obi, anything else that you want to call out that you think differs your first question from your second?
No, yeah, nothing else to call out. I just think, one of the most important things as we all work through this process is little things mean so much. And so really that top-down piece that Chris is talking about, as you practice this, if you incorporate that just at the start, it's going to help you so much, because it helps your thought process flow, and it helps you keep track of where you are in the case as well sometimes, which is super helpful when you're under a lot of stress.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's perfect. What just popped up on the screen is another potential answer for this question. You'll notice we had three major categories: cost, price, and product mix. That idea of product mix being, hey, how do we change like the quantity of certain products that we sell? Price, there's likely that we mentioned that we have acquired market share very quickly, so maybe there's some discounting going on. And then some of these costs that Obi talked about, right? What you see on the screen is what a lot of people refer to as an issue tree. Notice that if you flip it sideways, it does kind of look like a tree with roots. The idea is you start on that left side, or if we rotate it, it would be at the top. But you start with the problem, possible profit reductions, things that are eating profit. And then you go to the key categories. These are large themes: the product mix, the cost, or the price. And then within each of those, there's a bucket of reasons or levers that might be affecting that variable, right? So let's look at cost. There's some variables, and this is me coming back to my engineering team, but look at the variables that actually will affect the others, right? You can never just say, let's lower cost. Instead, you can say, let's lower what we spend on raw materials, because that will drive our cost down, right? Let's lower how much labor we're putting into the product so that we're not spending so much on manpower. So these are the levers that you would pull or push, right, in this theoretical business machine to affect cost. And you can do it for the others, and how these all affect the business in the end is that they impact the profit. So this is how we'd want to see you structure out your answer on a page. These are the thoughts that you would write out. And if you're feeling particularly bold, you can flip the page and actually manually walk your interviewer through each of these to give them a visual aid as well as an auditory one. Looks like we have about 20 minutes left in the session. So we're going to go on to the next question. And I'm actually going to have Obi just give you an example of what a really good answer would be for the quantitative portion. So here we're going to have an opportunity to actually look at a graph. Activewear has provided us with the following industry comparison data. What insights can you gather from the provided visuals? And if we could pop those up, Obi's going to take a moment to scan the graph itself and then draw some conclusions that would impact the business. Can we skip to the next slide? Yeah, perfect. All right, so we're presented with some data, and Obi's going to go ahead and draw some insights.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. So I'm going to pretend that I've had like a minute or two to look at it. And so then after that, this is a really interesting graph. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and looking at it similarly. Where first we're looking at just total annual revenues for both the industry and our specific company, right? What stands out to me is that just 3 years ago, they had about 16% of the market. The way that I came to that was by looking at what their share was of activewear, that darker red rectangle, compared to the share of the total industry, right? So looking at about 0.2 over that 1.2 billion, that's sort of how I came to that 16, 17%. What's interesting now, though, is that this year they are nearly at 50% of the market, which shows tremendous growth in that amount of time. So, it typically with growth like that, you have a very aggressive strategy. Either your customers super love what you're offering, or you have, different sales perhaps, or offering discounts, kind of like the way that Uber did, where they were throwing coupons left and right to people to use their service, and it helped their revenues grow. And so with that overall, it makes me think that there could be a potential challenge in terms of the margin of the products, perhaps, or specifically just their kind of play right there. I think one other thing that I wanted to mention too, though, was that the industry itself has grown, added an additional $400 million from 3 years ago until now. And though we have grown rapidly too, I think it's going to become harder to fight for a greater share because they've likely eaten into the share of competitors. So with that, Chris, would you like for me to sort of draw some conclusions at this part?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and summarize the case for us and potential conclusion for the client?
Great. So just to confirm, our client was Activewear. They had been facing incredible growth over the past 3 years, but decreasing margins. And from our conversations, we've seemed to have identified that there is an issue in terms of the pricing of their products and their mix. And for that, we recommend three core things. First is to reevaluate the product mix of what they're selling. Given that they have a wide range of $50 to $325, if there can be a greater push on that higher margin side, they can still maintain their revenues, likely lower the quantity that they're selling, but still be incredibly competitive. I think second, it's really worth assessing some of the marketing spend that they have. So whether that is through discounts offered on the products, or whether that is the channel in which they sell their ads, right? Given that this is online and the way that Google and Facebook are at play, they tend to capture the benefit of ad spend, and it's incredibly expensive, right? And so then it might be worth reevaluating other methods. And so whether that is partnerships, let's say, with corporate institutions to bring Fitbits to work, to Shell, for example, or something different. And then the last but not least, I think, is just it'd be a helpful space to understand, like, what if their products resonate with consumers? If it's high quality, for example, they can really lean into that higher price margin range. I just want to quickly throw out one risk I see, which is given that they have 50% of the market, there's a huge regulatory risk at play here right now if they were to try and grow any more aggressively. And so they're in a tough spot, right? Price lower, it's anti-competitive. Price higher could also be anti-competitive. And that's something that we'd be happy to work through as a firm with you as a client.
Cool, thanks. So really quickly, what we did in the summary there, Obi killed it because he, one, took data from the beginning of the case and findings that he had throughout our conversation, right? Throughout this quantitative analysis that he just did on the graph, and used it to back up his recommendations, right? He said, you've acquired this large amount of market share very rapidly. Usually that strategy is accompanied with some sort of price discounts or heavy marketing. That aligns with my structure from the previous question, saying, hey, we should look at costs, including marketing, and we should look at price, including things like discounts. So it's really important to remember you're solving the whole problem. You're not solving three separate questions. You're solving three questions that are part of a broad problem, a profit problem, right? And so that's what he did. He pulled all this information into a couple recommendations, very clear, very actionable recommendations that he can give to the client. What I also loved is he talked about risk at the end. He said, listen, every decision in business comes with some risk. So here's one major risk I can think about. And here's a way that you could, think about it, or we can help you, right? We can move forward. And that's kind of that extra flair at the end. He was showing off a little bit because he's showing that he knows how consulting works. Consulting works by continuously identifying ways that your clients can be better and convincing them to bring you on to help them do that. And that's what he did. So he showed a little knowledge of the industry. He showed that he can solve a whole problem. And he showed that he can use data to back up his assertions, which is really good. You'll notice at the beginning, we start with a broad net and we say, hey, there's a lot of reasons a company like this can be shrinking their profits, right? So here's all the reasons. And then I showed him some data and he said, okay, that throws out some of these reasons. So now I'm going to look at these. And then we get to the recommendation and he's prioritizing based on what he thinks will be most effective. So really good. Obi, thank you so much for being an awesome interviewee. Round of applause for Obi. I see this one question that's really interesting here. That popped up, and it's relevant to what we just went over. It said, if Obi had other factors to present from his thought process, would it have been okay for him to list all of them, considering that he has to dive deeper into explanations? If yes, wouldn't this take too much time?
Mm-hmm.
Prioritization is huge. And one of the really great things that Obi did is he said, hey, I've got these other categories too that I could think about, like things like tariffs or other extraneous circumstances, but I don't think they're the key factors, right? And so notice how he spent the most time explaining the most important, most logical factors, the revenue and pricing portion and the cost and raw materials portion. He spent probably 60 to 70% of his time explaining the most important stuff. Mm-hmm. And then he took the last 20% of his time saying, hey, there's this other stuff we can look at, but I really don't think it's going to be the key factor. And that's where your intuition comes into play. That's where that business acumen comes into play. So it's okay to list other reasons. It's okay to be fully comprehensive, but put your energy where the money is, right? I'm not going to go try to fight tariffs because I think the amount of savings we could get out of trying to fight the government is going to be minuscule. But if we can lower our cost of raw materials, if we can raise our prices, that's going to have a much more immediate impact. And it's probably the path of least resistance. Yeah.
Yep, I would totally agree, Chris. The one other thing I would say too for that question, Judith, what is really good is that sometimes in interviews, you'll find that the interviewer will actually ask you. So they'll say, okay, you mentioned tariffs, Obi. Tell me more about that. And
Yeah.
that's their opportunity of really learning about the other things that you considered at play. So it's good to have that in your back pocket, but you want to use your time to shine versus letting all the other industry or factors at play shine instead.
And remember, there's value in being concise.
Yep.
CEOs don't want to sit there and listen to consultants talk for 2 hours about every reason under the sun why they might be losing money, right? They want to know the 3 big hitters. They want to know what your action plan is, and they want to go and get it done. They're not paying you to make lists, right? They're paying you to hopefully help their company. So that's an example of a case interview. Typical interview will be a little bit longer, a little bit more comprehensive, but hopefully you've benefited from the opportunity to kind of see a sampling there and see Obi really kind of show you how it's done. The best thing you can do to get better at these is practice. And so if you're in an MBA program, there's likely a consulting club when you join the program, and they'll have lots of example cases. Pair up with other people that are prepping for consulting, and also go on your target firm's websites. McKinsey, for example, if you go on our recruiting site, we have 4 example cases that you can walk through. And there are examples of answers, good answers and great answers. Deloitte also has that. Accenture might have some example cases.
Yeah, they have some, but it's mostly sent when people are interviewing versus
okay. Yeah, but like, there's tons of websites like Prep Lounge and all different websites where there's going to be great advice on there as well. I think with our last 10 minutes, we'll probably be better off answering some of your questions. So feel free to keep firing them away in the chat box. And I'm actually going to put Obi on the spot with this one. One is advised to ask questions that are not answered on companies' websites during informational interviews. How do we get insights on how or what best questions to ask that wouldn't be extraneous? So in your experience interviewing, what are some good questions that you ask people, and kind of where's the line for appropriate and not?
That is a great question, and I think one of the things that really helped me with that is tied to the point that we were making earlier about having that sponsor at the firm. And the reason why that is so important is because that gives you information about really what does it look like every day in and out at the firm. And from that, you can start to sort of formulate your own questions. And so you might be asking, like, what does that really mean, right? So, for example, I'm in the healthcare space, and when I was interviewing, I wanted to talk to somebody that worked there. And so I had a conversation with a colleague who told me about the work he was doing at a hospital and the way that they were trying to care for children. And they decided to use a new sort of data system to help drive that, right? So now at the interview, instead of me asking a bad question, which is, what type of work do you do at hospitals, right? That's a bad example. But one that's not found on the website that I can instead ask is, I hear you do a lot of digital transformation work at hospitals, and you recently did one for young children. Can you tell me more about that? Or have you thought about exploring that with cancer patients? Or however you want to twist it, and that shows a deeper level understanding of the firm, their work, and I think also helps you stand out as a candidate. So to help do that, as you have conversations with people like Chris or like myself or whoever, take notes on it. I did that throughout the process to capture those stories and refer back to them as I progress through the interviews.
That's awesome. I'm going to hit you with another one too. So there's this notion of consulting target schools. From your experience, how critical does this come into play in the application process, and what advice can you give?
Yeah, I think so. Honestly speaking, it is very much a thing. Like target schools are a big thing, but I think it's really important to not be deterred by that. And here's why. Right? What target schools mean are that this is a school that has a relationship with the firm, and the firm goes there deliberately to recruit, and they'll take a certain number of people. Right? At more prominent institutions, it can be upwards of 20, 30 people. Whereas at smaller institutions like in Ohio State, it might be a handful, right? But the key thing to understand, though, is that I've looked at resumes from people at amazing schools and that people from Ohio State or wherever it is, and they all shine. It's a matter of the principles that we spoke about earlier. Having that strong resume, building that connection, and finding somebody to get your foot into the door. And I think what's great about that is that in particular, you can do it and come out of the experience without being $100,000, $200,000, whatever it is, in debt. It is an uphill battle, I won't lie, and it does take a lot of work to find people that can kind of be that sponsor. But that's part of the work that Anu has really been leading to make that opportunity equal and accessible for really everyone. And I know I speak for Chris by saying we're here every step of the way to help make that happen for wherever you want to be. But Chris, go ahead too.
No, you're good. I think you nailed it. I think the only thing I can't stress enough is that idea of evangelists, right? It's no mystery, and nobody's ever going to try to lie to you and tell you this isn't true, that people going to Harvard have people at consulting firms looking for their resumes. And if your resume says you go to Harvard Business School, yes, you're going to get a second look. But if you do your due diligence and you put in the work and build those evangelists, right? Build relationships with people at the firms in the offices that you want to go to. You want to work in the New York office? Make connections with people in the New York office. If you want to work in San Francisco, find people and connect with them in San Francisco. The goal is when you apply, that person in the San Francisco office is saying, oh, Chris just applied to this job. He emailed me. I'm going to go look for his resume and make sure the recruiter gets it in their hand, right? That's huge, because at that point, if your resume is being looked at by someone, it doesn't matter what school you went to, because ideally you've written your resume in a way that showcases all of your skills, and those skills are irrelevant of where you've been. And I speak for myself, and I would hope that the experience has been the same for Obi. But the moment I stepped in the door at McKinsey, nobody asked me where I did my graduate degree. Nobody asked me where I did my undergrad. They gave me a pile of work and they said, hey, here, show me how you can contribute. And it didn't matter if I went to Harvard. It didn't matter if I went to Columbia. It didn't matter if I went to community college. The moment you're in the door, it's your moment to prove yourself. And it doesn't matter what school you went to. If you go in and you can't keep up, they don't care what degree you have, right? And the same thing happens in the interview. I think if you get through the process to the interview and you're in the room, all bets are off. They're interested in you. They like your resume. They like your background, and it's your opportunity to shine. So don't let your brand hold you back. Don't let whatever school you go to hold you back, because I think there's too much weight put on that. And really what we need to focus more on is the weight that you put on yourself as an individual.
Agreed.
Yeah. What else do we got in here?
Yeah. How would you relate case interview questions to behavioral and situational interview questions?
Nice. I'm going to go ahead and say that behavioral and situational interview questions are actually pretty synonymous. Most of them fall into the similar categories. Yeah. It's all experience interviews, right? They're looking at, here's what recruiters do. They look at your past experience and they try to use your experience as data to prove how you're going to work in the future, right? And so that's what they're trying to do. Think about what the skills are that firms are looking for. This goes for any career. If you're an investment banker, what do investment bankers do on a daily basis? What are the 5 key skills that they need to have? Mm-hmm. And then use experiences that showcase that. The case interview in particular is looking specifically at how you use skills together. So how do you use analytical skills to assess a chart, but then combine that with your communication skills to show me the trends that you identified? And then how do you use your problem solving skills to figure out how those values you extrapolated or those trends from that chart, how they relate to the problem being solved? And so usually with situation or behavioral interviews, they're looking for one specific skill. Tell me about a time when you dealt with a difficult team member. Okay, so we're looking at conflict resolution. Tell me about a time when you overcame a very difficult problem. They're looking for persistence and resilience and creative problem solving. Case interviewing instead is they're looking specifically at how do all of these skills play together. Mm-hmm. And so that's what makes it hard. And that's why practice is important, because they want to see you practicing all of those constantly, right? Mm-hmm. Resilience because it's a difficult problem, communication because you want to communicate your answer, problem solving because you want to think about the next steps and the risk like Obi did. Yeah. Obi, anything?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. When it came to the case interview, I know everyone sort of has their own particular style, and something that I found really helpful for me is thinking about the case interview with 2 different components. The first is the content, and then the second is the delivery, right? Yeah. So the content are the things such as the structuring, knowing if it's something about profit, that there's cost and revenue to it. If it's a new product, if there's interest in it, and if it's aligned to what the company does. right? Those are the content bits. And that is where I think typically most people really spend their time. And it's important to have that. And what I share with people is that really work so that you can kind of master the content, because a lot of people are going to be able to structure, but when you can deliver it, so, sharing your own story, sharing your interest in whatever it is or your knowledge of it, that combined together is incredibly, incredibly appealing.
Yep. It looks like we're right at time, so I think we'll probably have to call it there.
Yeah. So hold on, Chris and Obi. We are right at time. It's 10:15 PDT, which is when we're supposed to end the webinar. I know that a few of you still have questions. So what we'll be doing is we'll be staying open for another 5 minutes. If you have any questions, you can still talk to us. But for every other person, that is fine. It's okay. You can leave the webinar. But if you still have questions, it's okay for you to ask questions in the chat box, and the consultants will still be available for another 5 minutes to answer the questions. Oh, that is fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see two that I definitely want to hit, one from Yao, one from Kemi, where the first is advising on time management for preparation so that you can meet the peak season for consulting. I know, Chris, you'll have some great insight. I have some stories as well. And then the second is tied to, what's the career path for somebody from undergrad who's entering the labor force? So an experienced hire versus maybe an academic recruit.
Yeah, did you want to take it, or you want me to kind of take one of those?
Yeah, I think you've done great work structuring the timeline bit, and then I'm happy to supplement, and then I can talk to the experienced hire part.
Yeah, the timeline, if you think back to the kind of that pathway that we put together to getting the job and how that application is so late in the process, what I would want you to do is work your way backwards, right? Mm-hmm. And so figure out what those timelines are for each firm and for each process. It's different based off of recruiting. So I did see a question there about undergrad. So undergrad is typically a little earlier in the fall for hiring for internships, and even earlier for hiring for full-time. Whereas graduate is usually a little later, so usually in like the winter timeframe in the U.S., so December, January. But if you're entering or in like a graduate program, you would want to check with their Office of Career Management or anybody that handles recruiting. If you're undergrad, then also the same thing. But essentially work your way back from that application deadline, right? And give yourself time to build those relationships, because it takes time. Give yourself time to find people at each firm to talk to and network, and give yourself time to write your resume. So I would say typically, like, you want to be thinking about this stuff no later than 3 months in advance, because that gives you time to reach out, do some back and forth. But one of the biggest things people always ask me before they go into their MBA is, what can I do before my MBA to prep? Once you enter school, once you enter grad school, it's really hard to go in and fill in experiences that you're missing. Mm-hmm. And so if you know right now, let's say you're working full-time and you want a job in consulting, think about what key skills we talked about today that make consultants successful. Think about critically your resume and where you might be having gaps or weaknesses, and then utilize this time to find work experience, involvement, clubs, activities, volunteer to fill those gaps. Mm-hmm. That way, when it does come time to apply, you have everything you need. I think that's really all that comes to mind, but Obi, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. And for me, it was definitely a trial and error process, right? So if you're in recruiting from an MBA program, the full-time recruitment starts in the fall. And with that, I recommend, for me, I really started trying to have my resume and the networking piece in depth during the summer. So as Chris said, 3 months in advance. So I spent that time during the summer having my initial understanding of the firms, reaching out via LinkedIn, having conversations. And then as we got closer to the recruitment season, I started to circle back to those people I spoke with in the summer and started to develop conversations with higher level individuals. So versus consultants, MDs, senior managers, engagement managers, etc. So that's the first part. When you're recruiting for internship, the interviews happen sort of over the January-ish timeframe. And so then, the fall is a great time to start sort of preparing for that. And so then the second question was tied to just the difference with being an experienced hire. And I would honestly say that a lot of the factors can translate. When it comes to your resume again, right? Having that strong story or being able to convey what your experiences were. So you might feel like, okay, well, I'm in a job that's focused on sales, right? Sales is a huge part of strategy and growing revenues for these companies. So really think about, what was your impact? How much did your sales add to the top line of revenue or to the bottom line of profit? How many people did you communicate with? What were the channels that you used? And build that out to your story. The piece that's going to be really important as an experienced hire, though, is having that network and the people to really be your sponsors, because it's less formalized. There's a ton of people applying online. And so really having somebody like put that resume, that paper in front of their face, and talk about the reasons why you're great is similarly important as a full-time hire out of undergrad.
Yeah. And I think that's our 5 minutes. I know personally I have to run.
Yeah. All right. So 5 minutes over for people that ask questions. I know Olabayo and Ifeoluwa ask questions. I'll be answering your questions offline and also respond to some of the questions here. Thank you so much, Chris and Obi. It's an honor to have both of you coach us today on how to land the job in consulting. Thank you, everybody that attended this webinar. If you need any help, send us an email, follow us on Instagram, and we'll be ready to help you and also connect you with consultants that can help you reach your goals. So thank you. Have an amazing
Thanks, everyone.
weekend.
See ya.